All right, get ready to dive deep into Visual-RFT, Visual Reinforcement Fine-Tuning. This paper really caught my eye,
Yeah.
It's got this clever way of making those big vision language models, the LVLMs, a lot more data efficient. Like imagine fine-tuning these huge models with just a few examples, not millions.
Yeah, exactly. And the paper shows some pretty impressive results.
Right.
Especially for those tasks where data is like super limited,
Right.
like fine-grained image classification or few-shot object detection. It's really fascinating how they've managed to combine the power of LVLMs with the efficiency of reinforcement learning.
So traditionally, how do we fine-tune these LVLMs? Basically, we just throw a ton of labeled data at them.
Yes, yeah, that's the classic approach. Supervised fine-tuning SFT. You show the model millions of examples and it basically memorizes the patterns.
Right.
But that can be really data-intensive and computationally expensive.
And that's where Visual-RFT comes in, right? It's
Yeah.
got a totally different approach.
Exactly.
Instead of just memorizing stuff, it's more about teaching the model to learn through trial and error, kind of like figuring out a puzzle.
Precisely. Visual-RFT uses this concept of verifiable reward functions. Basically, specific rules that evaluate the model's answers based on the task.
Okay.
So for object detection, the reward might depend on how well the model's bounding boxes align with the actual objects in an image.
Got it. So the model gets feedback, right? And then some algorithm helps it refine its answers over time.
Right.
The paper mentions using group relative policy optimization, or GRPO. How does that fit in?
Yeah, GRPO is like the learning engine. It guides the model through this process of generating answers, getting that feedback through those reward functions,
Right.
and then refining its approach to get the best rewards. Learning from mistakes, basically, and improving with each try.
And this approach seems to be working really well, right? They tested Visual-RFT in a bunch of different tasks.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. They tackled some tough ones, fine-grained image classification, where the categories are really subtle, and few-shot object detection, where you only have a tiny bit of data to work with.
And it consistently outperformed the traditional SFT, even with way less training data.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about tasks like telling apart different types of flowers
Exactly.
or identifying breeds of dogs.
Yeah.
Stuff that usually needs massive data sets to be accurate.
Exactly. And what's even more exciting is that Visual-RFT seems to enable these models to generalize to things they haven't even seen before. It can identify objects that it hasn't been trained on. That's a big step toward more robust AI,
Yeah, this is huge for anyone working with LVLMs.
For sure.
But let's break down how this Visual-RFT framework actually works. Figure 3 in the paper lays it out pretty clearly, step by step.
Right. So let's say a user gives the model an image and a question.
Right.
Something like, what kind of plane is this?
So the model has to look at the picture, come up with an answer, but it doesn't just give a single guess, does it?
No, not quite that simple. The policy model, which is the core of Visual-RFT, actually comes up with multiple answers.
Okay.
And each answer has its own reasoning, showing how the model got there.
So it's not just a black box spitting out answers, it's actually explaining its thought process.
Exactly. And then each of those answers is evaluated using those verifiable reward functions we talked about.
Right.
That's where the task-specific rules come in. For object detection, it might be the IOU score. That measures how well the model's box overlaps with the actual object.
Right.
For classification, it might be just how accurate the prediction is.
So the model's getting feedback on each potential answer, basically.
Exactly.
Telling it how close it is to the right one, and then it uses that to get better.
Precisely. And to keep the model from going totally off track during learning, they use this thing called KL divergence.
Okay.
It's kind of a way to keep the model's learning in check, preventing it from straying too far from a reference model.
Like a safety net.
Right, balancing exploring new things with staying stable.
Now, those verifiable rewards seem to be really important here. The paper goes into some detail about different reward functions, specifically the IOU reward for object detection and the CLS reward for classification. Let's start with IOU. What's that all about?
Okay, so IOU, or intersection over union, is all about how well the model's bounding box matches the actual bounding box of the object,
Right.
In the data.
So how accurately it can draw a box around the object.
Exactly. And the IOU reward actually has 3 parts. You've got the average IOU, which is just that direct measure of overlap.
Yeah.
Then there's a confidence reward, which encourages the model to be more confident when it's right and less confident when it's wrong. And finally, there's a format reward to make sure the output is structured properly, using HTML tags like think and answer.
So it's not just about getting the right answer, it's also about how the model presents its answer.
Exactly.
How sure it is about it. What about the CLS reward? the one for classification tasks.
Yeah, the CLS reward or classification reward is similar. It also uses a format reward to keep the output structured, but the main focus there is on just classifying the image correctly.
So both are focused on accuracy and good output, but IOU also cares about how confident the model is.
Right.
All right, I think we've got a good foundation for how Visual-RFT works. Now let's get to the fun part, the results. What do they find?
Let's start with the fine-grained image classification. Remember, these are tasks where the categories are super subtle. Visual-RFT got some really impressive improvements, especially when you only have a little data.
The paper mentioned a big boost, something like a 24.3% improvement on one-shot learning for one dataset. That's huge.
It is, yeah.
And they saw this same trend of beating the baseline in SFT across a bunch of datasets, right?
Across the board, we're talking Flower 102 with hundreds of flower species, Pets 37 for dog breeds, FGVC aircraft for airplane models, Cars 196 for car models, all sorts of stuff.
Wow, so even with just a few examples, Visual-RFT could classify these really specific categories.
That's right.
That's pretty amazing. And it wasn't just image classification. It did well on few-shot object detection too, right?
Yeah, it consistently outperformed SFT in terms of MAP, average precision.
Right.
Think of that as how well the model can find and locate objects in an image.
And they tested this on COSIO and LVIS, those big data sets for object detection.
Right. COSIO is more about everyday objects, while LVIS has a much wider variety, including some rare and unusual ones.
And it did well on both.
It did.
So it wasn't just memorizing specific objects. It could actually generalize and adapt to new objects it hadn't seen before, especially on that LVIS data set with all those different categories. That's a big deal.
It is. It really shows that Visual-RFT isn't just a one-trick pony. It can handle all sorts of object detection challenges.
All right, so we've got fine-grained classification and few-shot object detection, both areas where Visual-RFT really shined. But there's another application they looked at, and it's really interesting, reasoning grounding. What's that all about?
So reasoning grounding is all about connecting language and visual understanding. It's the model's ability to understand instructions that refer to specific objects in an image and then actually find those objects.
So it's not just recognizing objects, it's understanding how they relate to what you're asking it to do.
Right, exactly. It needs a deeper level of understanding than just labeling things.
Yeah.
And Visual-RFT did really well here. It even outperformed models specifically designed for reasoning grounding tasks.
They used the LISA dataset for that, right? And the one made for these reasoning challenges.
Yes, that's the one.
And they saw big improvements in accuracy.
They did, yeah.
Measured by the mean IOU score, which shows how well the model can pinpoint the right objects.
Exactly. And there are some great examples in the paper, in Figure 5. You can actually see how the model is thinking step by step.
Oh, cool.
It's like you're looking into the AI's mind as it breaks down those instructions and connects them to what it sees in the image.
Wow, that's fascinating. It really shows how the model can bridge that gap between language and visual perception, which is super important for building AI that can actually interact with the real world.
Absolutely. This ability to understand instructions is going to be key for things like robots working with humans or AI assistants helping us with everyday tasks.
So we've talked about fine-grained classification, few-shot object detection, and reasoning grounding. Visual-RFT's done really well in all those areas. But we haven't even touched on one of the most groundbreaking things, open vocabulary object detection. This is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah, this is where it gets really wild.
So tell me, what is open vocabulary object detection?
It takes that idea of generalization to a whole new level. Remember how we talked about the model recognizing objects it's never seen before? Well, now imagine a model that can identify anything, even if it wasn't specifically trained on that object. That's open vocabulary detection.
That's amazing. So instead of being limited to a set list of objects, it can handle anything you throw at it.
Exactly.
Which is super important for real-world situations where things are always changing.
Right.
So how do they even test this?
They took Visual-RFT and trained it on a bunch of categories from COCO. Then they tested it on totally new categories, both from COCO and from LVIS, which has those rarer, more unusual objects.
Okay, and what happened?
The results were remarkable. Visual-RFT got much better at Moreau, proving it could learn about unseen objects.
Wow.
On some of those rare LVIS categories, the baseline models just completely failed. But after training with Visual-RFT, the model went from 0 to hero.
Really?
Achieving some actual accuracy on those objects it had never seen before.
That's incredible. It's almost like the model developed a deeper understanding of what an object is. and could apply that to new things.
Exactly. It opens up so many possibilities for using AI in the real world where you might not have data for every single object.
Right.
Think about self-driving cars seeing a new type of vehicle, or a robot navigating a warehouse with unfamiliar objects. It's pretty amazing.
This is mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah.
This ability to handle open vocabulary object detection could change how we think about AI and how it perceives the world.
It really could.
All right. I think we've covered the main points of Visual-RFT, from its new approach to training with limited data to its impressive performance on all these tough tasks.
Yeah, we've hit the highlights.
But there's one more experiment I want to talk about before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
You mean the experiment with the MG dataset?
Yes, the Monster Girls dataset. This one really stood out to me because it seems so different. Why test this model on anime-style images?
It's all about pushing the limits, you know? Seeing how well this approach works on different types of data, the goal is to build AI that can adapt to anything, not just the specific data sets we train it on.
So it's a test of how robust it is, right? Can it handle something completely different from those realistic images in Coseco and LVIS?
Exactly. And once again, Visual-RFT did better than expected, outperforming SFT even in this unfamiliar territory.
That's fascinating. It makes you think that the ideas behind Visual-RFT could be used for way more than just the tasks and data sets they explored in this paper.
I think so too. It really shows the power of combining reinforcement learning with those rich representations that these big vision language models can learn.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part. We've unpacked the key ideas behind Visual-RFT, seen how well it performs, and even talked about how it could be used in different ways.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot more to discuss.
Definitely.
Including what this all means for the future of AI and some of the challenges that need to be addressed.
Absolutely.
So stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back.
So before the break, we were talking about testing Visual-RFT on those anime-style images.
Yeah, using that MG dataset, short for Monster Girls. They wanted to see, could this model handle something beyond those typical, real-world pictures?
The good test for generalization, right? Throwing something totally different at it and seeing what happens.
Exactly. And it did surprisingly well. Visual-RFT kept beating supervised fine-tuning even on this totally different data set.
Which tells us that the ideas behind Visual-RFT might be useful for a lot more than we initially thought.
Absolutely.
This ability to adapt to different visual styles it's pretty crucial for real-world AI.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, the world isn't just made up of those perfect, high-resolution images from standard data sets.
Right.
Think about robots, for example.
Yeah.
They have to work in all sorts of messy, unpredictable environments, or even in medical imaging, where the pictures can look so different.
Right. Exactly.
The Visual-RFT did so well on that MG data set. I mean, it really shows its potential for handling those kinds of situations.
It does.
It makes you think, with all this interest in synthetic data for AI training,
Yeah.
if a model can learn from anime, what other kinds of synthetic data could we use, to train even better AI systems?
That's a great question. Synthetic data has a lot of potential, right? For data scarcity, bias, privacy, all those things. And the success on that MG data set, it kind of hints that we could use all sorts of creative synthetic data to train these models.
It's like we're expanding what AI can learn from.
Yeah.
It's not just about copying the real world anymore.
Right.
It's about exploring, new data frontiers.
I like that. Exploring new data frontiers. That's a good way to put it.
Now, let's zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
Where does Visual-RFT fit in the big picture of AI research? We've talked about how it's more efficient, but what are the bigger implications, for the future of AI?
I think what's really groundbreaking is how Visual-RFT kind of bridges this gap between, data-driven approaches and reasoning-based approaches.
Right.
We've always relied on huge data sets to train AI, but as we see here, we can do amazing things with less data if we use reinforcement learning and these reward functions.
So instead of just force-feeding information, we're teaching AI to actually think smarter.
Exactly. Visual-RFT is a step towards AI that can actually solve problems, not just recognize patterns.
And that could open up so many new possibilities for research, especially in areas where we just don't have a lot of data, like scientific discovery or personalized education, even the arts.
Absolutely. Think about it. AI that could help scientists analyze complex data and come up with new hypotheses,
Right.
Or personalized learning platforms that tailor to each student's needs,
Yeah.
or AI tools that help artists and designers be even more creative.
It's like we're entering this new era of AI,
It feels like it.
One that's all about efficiency, adaptability, and really understanding the tasks at hand.
I agree completely. And as researchers keep digging into this, I think we'll see even more amazing applications.
Okay, so we've been pretty optimistic about Visual-RFT so far.
Yeah.
But what about the downsides? Are there any challenges or areas where more research is needed?
Of course, there are always challenges. One big one is designing those verifiable reward functions. We've talked about how important they are for guiding the AI's learning,
Right.
but it's not always easy to define what makes a good or bad outcome, especially for complex tasks.
It's not always black and white.
Exactly.
Some things are subjective.
Right, like image classification or object detection. Those have clear metrics like accuracy or IOU. But what about things like writing a good story or composing music? How do you define a reward for that?
It's hard to translate those human intuitions into something that AI can learn from.
Exactly, and that's a challenge that's only going to get bigger as AI tackles more complex and nuanced problems.
And another thing, what about scaling this up? We've seen great results on these specific tasks, but what about those massive language models, the ones with billions or even trillions of parameters?
Yeah, that's a big question. Scaling up any AI system always has challenges, right? Both in terms of computing power and also, potential for unexpected behaviors.
So it's not just about size, it's about making these models smarter and more efficient.
And making sure they align with human values.
Right.
And I think Visual-RFT is a really promising step in that direction. But it's still early days. There's so much more to explore.
I think that's a great point to move on to the final part of our deep dive. We've dug into the technical side, the results, the broader implications.
I have.
But before we wrap up, let's think about the real-world impact of all this. What does this mean for the future of AI applications? And what ethical considerations should we be thinking about?
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Visual-RFT. We've really covered a lot, from the technical details to how this could totally reshape AI. But before we wrap up, let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture.
Definitely. It's not just about the algorithms and the data sets, right? It's about how this research can actually impact the world.
Exactly. Visual-RFT kind of gives us this glimpse into a future where AI isn't just about these, huge data-hungry models, but it's more about nimble, adaptable learners. What do you think that means for the kinds of applications we'll see, say, 5-10 years down the line? One thing that comes to mind right away is personalized learning. Imagine AI tutors that can actually adjust to each student, how they learn best, at their own pace, giving them custom lessons and feedback. That ability of Visual-RFT to learn from limited data could be huge for creating truly personalized education.
That's a great point. And it's not just education, right? Think about healthcare. Visual-RFT could be used to build AI diagnostic tools that are more accurate, more efficient, especially in areas where medical data is hard to come by.
Exactly. And because you can train these models on smaller, more focused data sets, it could really empower smaller research teams, startups even, to contribute to AI in a big way.
It's like democratizing AI, right? Giving more people the tools to actually build and use these powerful technologies. But with that comes a lot of responsibility, right? If more people have access to these tools, how do we make sure they're used ethically?
That's a really important question, and it's something the AI community needs to be talking about, like right now. We need guidelines, best practices, to make sure these technologies are used for good and don't cause harm.
Yeah, it's not just about stopping people from using them for bad things.
Right.
It's also about those unintended consequences, right?
Right.
Even with good intentions, AI can still be biased if it's trained on biased data.
Absolutely, and that's why transparency is so important.
Yeah.
We need to understand how these models make decisions, what data they're trained on, what biases might be hiding in their algorithms.
And that transparency needs to go beyond just the researchers.
Yeah.
We need to be talking to the public, policymakers, industry leaders,
Everyone.
to create a real conversation about the ethics of AI.
I couldn't agree more. This is a societal issue as much as it's a technical one.
Right.
We have to work together if we want AI to benefit everyone and not just make existing inequalities worse.
It's a big challenge, but we can't ignore it.
Definitely not.
If we want a good future for AI,
Yeah.
we have to develop these technologies responsibly and thoughtfully.
Well said.
So I think as we finish up this deep dive into Visual-RFT, the biggest takeaway is this. It's not just some technical breakthrough, it's a peek into the future.
Yeah.
A future where AI is more efficient, more adaptable, and hopefully more in line with our values.
I like that.
It's a really exciting time to be working in AI, and research like this makes me optimistic about where we're headed. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of AI Paper Podcasts.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Visual-RFT. Be sure to check out the links in the description for the full paper and other resources. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with AI.